Really nice to welcome you all to our latest Autism Journal Club session. And it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers for today, Gemma Williams and Sarah Garfinkel. And we'll have some time for discussion and Q&A to be done towards the end. And with the Q&A, if you can ask questions in the chat for this session. I know this is the first time we're using Teams for one of these journal club meetings, so bear with us with the technical aspects. People. So just going to hand over in a sec to Gemma and Sarah. I was just going to read off what the title of the article was then. I'll leave that to Gemma and Sarah then instead. So yeah, over to you both, and you're able to share.
So I'm just trying to share my screen. Can you see the PowerPoint? Okay.
Yeah, perfectly.
Okay, great. So yeah, thanks, Damien. Thank you so much for having us. It's really great to be here. I've really enjoyed coming along to some of these sort of discussions and the Journal Club about other papers. So it's really nice to be able to contribute. Okay, so I'm just getting my head around the moving through the presentation thing. Okay, technology. So this is the paper that we're talking about today. Hopefully you'll have had a chance to read it. It's just been pre-printed really recently, a week or two ago, and the link is down here at the bottom of the page. If you haven't read it, that's fine, because we're going to talk you through it today. So just before we begin properly, a little trigger warning. We're talking about loneliness. That's the topic of the paper. So that can be a challenging and upsetting topic sometimes. So just be kind to yourself. If you're finding it uncomfortable, feel free to tune out or turn the volume off. And there are a couple of links here for go to if you want to connect with someone about it. So there are lots of authors in this paper, and Sarah will introduce most of them to you shortly. The lead author is Lisa Quatt, and she couldn't be here today, but she'll be watching the video back, I think. She's a really great ally to autistic people, and she's involved in some really interesting research. So if you haven't read any of her stuff so far, I recommend digging it out. So I'm joined by Professor Sarah Garfinkel, who will take over talking shortly. She's a senior author on this paper, and she currently leads the Clinical and Affective Neuroscience Group at UCL. And her work centres around interoception and looking at emotion processing, how it can be altered in different groups, but I'm sure she'll do a better job of introducing herself. So this paper, it's quite an interesting way that we have come to work on it, I think. We've taken a mixed methods approach, and we've come from sort of different starting points and different methodologies, and we've joined together on our shared interest in autistic people's experiences of loneliness. We were both working on, the two sort of different groups were working on different primary research projects. In my case, it was my PhD research, which involved close linguistic analysis of conversations between autistic and non-autistic people. And in Sarah and Lisa and their team's case, they were undertaking a larger scale study, trialling an intervention around interoceptive training. Again, I'm bungling this, I'm sure Sarah will explain it better. And we were having conversations and collaborating and other things, and we realised that we both had really interesting data around loneliness that kind of mirrored and yeah, it kind of integrated well. So that's how this paper came about. So I'm just going to give a very brief introduction, and then we'll talk about the two components of the paper. So what we know about autism and loneliness already: rates of loneliness are up to 4 times higher in the autistic population compared to a non-autistic population. We know that autistic people have a greater vulnerability to the negative physical and psychological consequences of loneliness. In autistic children and adults, loneliness correlates with increased depression and anxiety. And it's associated with a greater risk of self-harm and increased suicidal thoughts and behaviour. And despite this, there's still a persistent negative stereotype that autistic people aren't motivated to seek meaningful social relationships. But what is loneliness? So it's a subjective phenomenon. It's something that's experienced by an individual. It's often conceptualized as the actual or perceived absence of meaningful social connection, but it's now acknowledged that the size of an individual's social network doesn't equal the satisfaction with social relationships. So as a result, often there's talk of a difference between emotional loneliness, which is the perceived lack of meaningful social connections, and social loneliness, so things like social isolation. Okay, so that's a kind of general overview. So I think we'll go to Sarah to talk about the first study of the paper.
Thank you very much, Gemma. I'm just going to share my. So hopefully you can all see my slides now.
Yeah.
Brilliant. It's a great pleasure to be able to speak to you all today. So thank you so much for the invitation. So Gemma's already done a great job in introducing Lisa, but I'd also like to flag her up as well. I made my slides, and then Lisa shared with me her slides, and I realized they were so much better than my slides. So I've also incorporated many of her slides within this presentation, and she really has been a driving force behind the empirical part of this collaboration with Gemma. And you can see a picture of her here, and on social media you can often see a picture of her as Taco, her wonderful dog. And the motivation for this study was really noticing, just as Gemma beautifully introduced, that loneliness is so much higher in the autistic population, potentially 4 times higher, and that there are very real risks associated with loneliness in the general population in terms of increased risk of morbidity and mortality. And we really wanted to challenge this stereotype that autism can be seen as a condition with diminished social motivation, which is really not something we subscribe to, and we wanted to collaborate and find empirical data to really show that this wasn't the case. And then inspired by Lisa, she tweeted to the autistic community to try and get words from them, which are incorporated throughout this presentation about loneliness and being autistic. And these I find deeply meaningful as they seem to complement the empirical work we're doing. So this individual did say that they love being alone, but it builds a complex picture because being alone means they don't have anxiety about how they come across, which is sort of linked to social anxiety, and also the desire to stim in public. So it shows you that maybe loneliness might not be a choice, or solitude might not be a choice. It may also be driven by other factors. And then there are certainly accounts which also contradict this stereotype that autistic individuals are motivated to be alone. And so in this study, we worked with over 100 autistic individuals and autistic controls, a wide spread between the ages of 18 and 64, and we took a variety of self-report measures. The loneliness scale, which is a scale that's used for loneliness research. As Gemma said, it's often done using subjective report, because only through subjective report can you see how lonely someone feels. But because we really wanted to probe the idea about whether loneliness was a distressing state for autistic individuals, we accompanied every question with, and how much does this upset you? And this allowed us to look at both levels of loneliness and levels of loneliness distress. So, for example, a question on the questionnaire would be, how often do you feel you're in tune with people around you? And then that was always followed by, and how much does this upset you? So for the questionnaire, we had both a measure of loneliness and loneliness distress. And we first wanted to probe the question, do high loneliness rates in autistic adults reflect choosing solitude without distress? And first of all, you can see that levels of loneliness were much higher in the autistic individuals relative to the non-autistic individuals. And this was highly statistically significant. And then when we analysed the distress question that followed, we found a wide spread of distress, but it was also highly significant in terms of higher loneliness distress also in autistic individuals. So this really radically challenges the notion that loneliness at the population levels is not associated with distress in autistic adults. When we correlated loneliness and loneliness distress in the non-autistic group, this was highly, highly significant. There was also a highly significant correlation in the autistic group, although it by eye looks maybe a little more scattered, showing that maybe there is more variance. When we did a statistical analysis to look at whether either of these slopes differed, they were not found to significantly differ. Thus, statistically, loneliness and loneliness distress are coupled to the same extent in autistic and non-autistic adults in our sample. And so this demonstrates that loneliness and loneliness distress are highly correlated, and autistic individuals do get highly distressed by being lonely. And this very much resonates with the tweets that we also got in response to probing this question online. So question 2, what is the relationship between mental health and loneliness in autistic adults? So we also looked at measures of depression and trait anxiety and found both of these to be highly elevated in the autistic group. I mean, this data really broke my heart when we graphed it, because you can see that red indicates highly severe levels of depression and anxiety, and potentially half the population, the autistic population, were having very severe depression and anxiety. And there was much more variance and lower levels in the non-autistic individuals. So depression and anxiety were significantly elevated in our autistic population. And then when we looked at the relationship between anxiety and depression with loneliness, but also sensory sensitivity, you can find this relationship where trait anxiety in autistic adults is highly associated to depression, loneliness, and sensory hypersensitivity. And in non-autistic adults, there was just a relationship between depression and anxiety. There was no relationship between loneliness. And so this tells me that there's this greater coupling of loneliness and anxiety in our autistic group, and that anxiety is also associated with these extra factors such as sensory hypersensitivity. So this leads us into question 3. What is the role of sensory sensitivity in loneliness and anxiety? And I was very struck by research which sort of signals how impairing sensory sensitivities could be. And we wanted to probe whether this could contribute to anxiety and depression, specifically by sensory sensitivities creating an external environment which can be very hard to be in with others. So we did a mediation analysis, and in order for a mediation analysis to be performed, you need a significant relationship between 3 variables. And we found that loneliness was significantly related to trait anxiety, so higher loneliness, higher anxiety, and that all 3 things were also related. So sensory sensitivity was also related to loneliness and anxiety. And when we performed a mediation analysis to see if the relationship between loneliness and anxiety arose through sensory sensitivity, this didn't account for the whole relationship. It was a partial mediation. But to put in more simple terms, you get this complex, intertwined relationship between loneliness, sensory sensitivity, and trait anxiety in autistic adults, with all 3 things related to each other. So
Sarah,
yeah.
We had a question. Can you explain what trait anxiety is?
My apologies. So trait anxiety is a propensity to be anxious. So we contrast that from state anxiety. So state anxiety is I'm anxious right now in this specific situation. And trait anxiety is just a general tendency to be anxious in all different situations. So to conclude, levels of loneliness and loneliness distress are higher in autistic adults. Loneliness is related to depression and anxiety, particularly in autistic individuals, and sensory sensitivity is related to both anxiety and loneliness. And what this says is I think we really need to create more inclusive environments, and this is something that the neurotypical and non-autistic community really need to become aware of, to challenge the idea that loneliness may be a choice for autistic individuals and really understand the nature of environments and how they may impose loneliness on individuals who are autistic. And so I'd also like to thank our autistic participants, the #ActuallyAutistic Twitter community, who I have learned so much from, and thank you for allowing your tweets to be included in this presentation. Thank you to parts of the team, Dennis, James and Marta. Thank you for Lisa for putting together this presentation. Gemma, for just being such a superstar. I've learned so much from you and you really inspire me to do so much of this research in collaboration with you and the autistic community, and I'm so grateful for that. And also Hugo and Anna-Marie Jones. And I'm happy to take any immediate questions now. Thank you for the one earlier, and I'll also hand back to Gemma for her rest of presentation. If I can find a way to stop sharing this screen.
Oh, thanks, Sarah. That's really sweet. Okay.
There's been some comments in the chat, so possibly questions coming in if you wanted to take some now.
So I'm happy to take any clarification ones which you think should be answered now, but I'm also happy to answer them at the end with Gemma, where we'll talk about all of these things together in more detail. So whatever you prefer, whatever the questions call for.
There was one from Joe that I may have answered incorrectly, but it was, can we take from this data that non-autistic participants were less adversely affected by their experiences of loneliness? To me, it wasn't quite that. It was more or less likely to be lonely in the first place.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. So the relationship between loneliness and loneliness distress is the same. So if you're very lonely, then you're likely to be equally distressed, whether you're autistic or non-autistic. But what the data is really saying, that if you're autistic, then you're more likely to be lonely, and by virtue of that, more likely to be distressed by your loneliness.
Yeah.
Okay, shall I go on to the second study?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. Okay. So the second part of this paper is a much smaller scale qualitative study, which involved 8 autistic adult participants, 3 male, 5 female. And they were invited to participate in 3 short naturalistic conversations each. So naturalistic means there wasn't a set of questions they were having to answer. They were just left to have a kind of free-form conversation. And the topic was loneliness. And so the 3 conversations they had, the first one was with a familiar and chosen conversation partner, so like a friend or family member. The second conversation was with an autistic stranger, one of the other 8 participants, and the third conversation was a non-autistic stranger. And these groups were included for the main linguistic study, because I was looking at whether familiarity had any impact on mutual understanding. But for this study, it doesn't really matter who they were talking to. They were just having conversations about the topic of loneliness. And there was also a 9th autistic participant who's been included in this analysis, who had 1 conversation. So the autistic participants were recruited through a group in Brighton called ESRC, and some of the people they were having conversations with, the non-autistic strangers, were recruited through the University of Brighton. So the conversations took place in a small room, and they were just left to have the conversations themselves. I put a recorder in there and left the room, and they were given just a couple of prompt questions. So things like, what does loneliness mean to you? Or do you think loneliness is a problem in Brighton and Hove? Just to get the conversation started. So after the conversations had been had and recorded, they were transcribed and then analysed using an inductive thematic analysis. So it involves going through the transcripts multiple times, reading them closely, coding them, and repeating that several times to identify themes that come through. And then I went back through it a second time once we had the findings from the first study that Sarah's just shared, to see if there was anything that my autistic participants had spoken about that either supported those findings or challenged them. So there were three main themes came out of this. So the first was that there are two different types of loneliness were being described. And the first was a practical kind of loneliness. So this included things like reduced opportunities to meet and spend time with other people due to perhaps financial constraints or an absence of community spaces, and a reduced ability to access the social spaces. So there's a quote here from, all of these are pseudonyms. So Daphne says, because I was looking out my living room window and I could see my aunt's house, which is the house she used to live in. And I thought, that's right over in Hampton Street. And I could see it. And I thought, well, from here, I could walk there. If it wasn't for all the roads, I could just walk over there. So it was a sense that there was this opportunity for connection, but the way that the cityscape had been built was too sort of stimulating and too difficult to navigate. And so it wasn't an option for her. And so the other type of loneliness that was spoken about, and the one that was spoken about the most, was a deeper yearning for meaningful connection with others. So we've got a quote from someone I've called Peter, and he says, because I feel, you know, say I'm in a group of people and they're all chatting away, because I'm not on their level, I feel lonely, even though I'm in that group. I feel lonely just sitting there. So yeah, these are really, some of these are really hard to hear, but I've been really grateful to our participants for sharing their experiences. And there's another one here from someone I've called Sarah, and this is where we got the title from the paper from. I'm trying to reach out, I'm trying to find my people, but it's not, as you say, it's not connecting deeply within me. It all still feels a bit hopeless and superficial. And so also in these conversations, other things that came up quite often, people spoke about these as both causes and effects of loneliness, difficulties in connecting with non-autistic people, difficulties in finding others with similar interests, a lack of being understood or accepted by a wider society, and mental health issues such as anxiety and depression. So all of these were spoken about as sort of sources of loneliness or causes, and as potential effects as well. The second theme was an autistic contentment in and need for spending time alone. And this was very clear, and a lot of people spoke about this. So we've got, I like being on my own. I need a lot of time by myself. I've spent a lot of time on my own. I'm quite happy on my own a lot of the time. I'm a very solitary person. I think my set point is about needing a lot of time for myself. I'm quite comfortable with my own company. So yeah, that was something that came up a lot. And the needing time alone was really common, but it didn't negate what was sometimes really extremely distressing experiences of loneliness that were reported on by the autistic participants in their conversations. So they spoke about a need for solitude, but they also spoke a lot about how loneliness was upsetting for them, and that seemed to relate to the experience of being overwhelmed as a result of spending time with others. Some of them specified non-autistic, others, and sometimes it was just being around people was overwhelming. So sometimes after spending much time with people, I could feel drained and like I just need some time out. So actually most of the friends I've made are actually autistic or around somewhere on the autism spectrum, because generally they're far more accepting of the fact that sometimes people need space. And then another participant said, I think my loneliness is to do with my condition though. I don't want to speak to people at work sometimes. It's like, no, I don't want to speak to you, just shush. I mean, I like peace and quiet. And I think here he was referring to the fact that he works in an office environment and people were constantly coming up to him and trying to talk and start, small talk, and he just wanted to get on with what he was doing. So just a quick summary of the findings from both of the studies combined. The autistic adults involved displayed not only higher levels of loneliness than non-autistic control participants, but the level of loneliness distress was also much greater. Sarah, maybe you can chip in and say if that's true or not. It sounds like that wasn't true. We can come back to that.
We'll come back in the discussion.
Okay.
No, it is true. It is true. It is true.
Okay.
Both were higher. So both were higher, but the relationship wasn't different.
That's it. Okay, thank you. So despite this, some autistic people were still choosing solitude or feeling like it was a necessary step that they needed to take to regulate if they're becoming overwhelmed, perhaps by sensory stuff or social stuff. But the desire for solitude and feelings of being distressed by loneliness weren't mutually exclusive. Levels of depression were significantly higher in the autistic group. loneliness and loneliness distress were more strongly linked with levels of anxiety in autistic than non-autistic participants. And sensory sensitivity, loneliness and anxiety were all connected somehow in autistic individuals. So when we're thinking about loneliness and the associated negative consequences in autistic individuals, it's important to think about in-person experiences, but also the societal context as well. And we have thought about a concept called ethical loneliness, which was coined by Jill Stauffer, which relates to the rejection of individuals or groups of individuals through repeated societal unethical behaviour. And Jill Stauffer describes ethical loneliness as something that's experienced when a violated person or member of a persecuted group has been abandoned by humanity or by those who have power over one's life possibilities. It's a condition undergone by persons who have been unjustly treated and dehumanized by human beings and political structures, compounded by the experience of not being heard. I think we've all found that quite a kind of important context to think about loneliness in. So although originally the concept of ethical loneliness was used in political contexts, there's a growing body of research now that's supporting the idea that autistic people are being abandoned by humanity in Stauffer's terminology. So there's literature around dehumanization and stigma, and Monique, both an autistic academic, has published around that in the last few months. And there's other literature around that. So yeah, in this context, we thought that perhaps some of the disconnect and the difficulties and the distress around loneliness that autistic individuals can sometimes experience, you know, is about attitudes from the non-autistic, you know, members of society, and also, like Sarah was saying earlier, about the way that environments are built that are, whether they're welcoming or not in terms of a sensory sensitivity. That was a bit of a rubbish conclusion, but thanks very much. Oh, we had questions, sorry. We had some suggested questions. Do you want those later, Damien?
Or you could share them now if you'd like.
Okay. Can you see that?
No. Oh, there we go.
Yeah. Okay.
This first question, I think, is very interesting one with what you've just been talking about with this parent relationship. And to me, it's very much a socially situated problem. So most social environments are not exactly low arousal environments in terms of the sensorium. And it struck me just how impactful these sensory sensitivities are in all aspects of life. But just the lack of accommodation, the lack of understanding, lack of universal inclusive design, that sort of thing. And it's building up barrier after barrier for social connection. And so with the sort of double empathy issues, if you're struggling with the environment sensorially, then how are you meant to even start connecting with someone?
And I really subscribe to that. Like I was speaking to an autistic therapist who was telling me about the intense world theory, the idea that the environment through sensory sensitivities can be so intense, then it sort of hijacks your brain, and that really diminishes the possibility in many ways in having these connections. And I think I'm strongly motivated to communicate to scientists and the general public about how hard these sensory sensitivities are, and how the data speaks to how that can be a driving force both for anxiety and to feelings of loneliness through then exclusion from social environments.
And it can impact whole families. So my son has quite extreme sensory sensitivities, particularly with noise. And I have quite strong sensitivities as well. And so in order to cope, that means much of social life is off limits, because it's just not even worth trying, because you know, the centre of town he'll sort of avoid and going for a walk. So it's like, oh, the high street, no, I'm not going to even try. And he's already learned, like, over the years, it's kind of better to avoid than trying to navigate and bear it, kind of thing.
I think that's what really touched me about one of the quotes I shared, in the kind of practical sense of loneliness. One of the participants was basically saying that she was an older autistic woman, and she was, you know, she had family members within the house was within sight from her window, and yet the street was so busy and overwhelming it just wasn't an option.
There's some comments coming in on the chat. It's difficult to navigate conflicting social messages, the way being social is framed by normative understanding, and also the prevailing pathological message that autistic people are not social. So where you begin to think we aren't social or not properly social. This is something I've come across myself. The autistic speaker, Ros Blackburn, who's did lots of presentations over the years, and she used to say that she just wasn't social and socially motivated in a sense, and it struck me as sort of living up to this stereotype a bit, but it was her perception. But then when you looked into it, it was kind of not being sociable in the neurotypical sense of the term. I'm pretty sure she wanted good, trusting relationships with her support workers and good rapport and understanding from them, which to me as a sociologist is still being social. Not having that support and understanding would have made their quality of life a whole lot worse. So it's even people who don't perceive themselves as socially motivated. It's how is that narrative being framed? Where has it come from? It's like the properly social bit of that.
And also, if you're interacting with people who aren't accommodating, then it can also perpetuate those feelings. And I think that's why it's so important to get the data out to show that there are many autistic people that really are wanting these connections, and it's a needed message for the non-autistic community so that they can potentially be more accommodating and reach out to make the connections themselves. I think it has to come from that side as well, and I hope this data sort of helps get that message across. And I think that if I was presenting different work, show a slide which we have where autistic individuals actually have higher empathy when you look at bodily signals, which when you look at the skin conductance response of the pain of others, autistic adults have a higher empathy response. And actually, it sort of shows that these situations can be more painful for autistic individuals when others are in pain, and maybe those higher feelings then dominate, but it's then completely reversing these stereotypes to show that, you know, autistic individuals are more lonely, more empathy, and then we need to find ways where we can combat these stereotypes.
I mean, emotional connection is a tricky thing because you may not associate or connect with something and emotionally respond if you're not even noticing necessarily. But the things you are noticing can be very emotionally powerful. So the idea that autistic people are somehow unemotional is for the birds.
Yeah.
And the things one does emotionally connect to is going to be very potentially extremely strong or overwhelmingly.
Yeah.
And to me, I feel a bit of a light switch thing. Either I'm got a very strong emotional response, or it's almost blocked off and disassociating sometimes from having an emotional response. Because if you do, it will consume you potentially.
Yeah.
There's an interesting question here. Strikes me that both studies, more autistic women participated than men. Is that a coincidence? Probably not. I'll let you answer that. And did the quantitative study look at possible differences between men and women?
So this is a great question, and it was actually while I was compiling these slides that I suddenly wished I'd done an analysis based on sex and gender. And actually, I mentioned it to Gemma when we were talking just before. So I noticed, and I should have clarified at the time, that one of the numbers was wrong. It was from an old slide. So we actually had almost even numbers in autistic individuals between males and females. Approximately like 50 something in each, but that lends itself beautifully to doing an analysis separately, and I haven't done that, but I will do, because I really do want to see. And it was in the non-autistic groups where we were much more loaded towards females. So at the moment I don't know if there were differences, but it is something that I definitely, only when I was making the graphs, became curious about to further investigate. So sorry, I don't have an answer for you right now, but this journal club was also really helpful in putting the question in my mind and making me want to look at it. I don't know if Gemma looked at it.
My group, the group of participants was so small, really. There were 9 people involved who's in this study. I think that it seems to be the case from what I've seen in reading papers as well, that often there is a greater number of autistic females like engaging with research. I'm not quite sure why that might be. That was another part of the question. Yeah, but I think it's quite common.
There's a question and comment here regarding a stereotype of not being socially motivated, and during the pandemic memes were shared saying everyone is now living how autistic people always wanted to. Some of these coming from autistic people themselves, and this was alienating, made one feel not validly autistic, and it's quite a complicated scenario, but to me there may have been some limited advantages in some respects to better balance of working from home, for example. But then if you're always working from home on Zoom meetings for a couple of years, it gets a bit tiresome, to say the least. And the lack of contact being an assumption and a generalization is a real problem, because even those who had beneficial responses to some aspects of lockdown, I think also had some very negative ones as well. And to just say it's all positive or all negative, or it may have been all negative for some of us, but it's kind of, to say all positive is just a bit ridiculous, really, as a generalisation. But it kind of plays into that not socially motivated stereotype.
I was reading a question when you started speaking, Damien, but also something about, like, in the period of time when things have been locked down and people have been working from home a lot more, that the whole social environment has changed a lot in terms of arousal and sensory stimulation. Things have been a lot quieter. So there's a social difference, but there's also kind of significant environmental difference as well. Just adding that.
It's just far more complicated than some have given it credit, I guess.
There was a comment I saw in the chat from Alison Druitt. It's kind of a question saying, is loneliness only about wanting social connections though, or is it also about loneliness born out of autistic people feeling that they're not understood? And I think in the qualitative, like in the conversations, that came up a lot. The autistic participants were talking a lot about finding it hard to find people that they could connect with or had shared interests with, or could find an affinity with, that it was harder. But I don't know if you've got any thoughts about that, Sarah.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I actually echo exactly what you say, really, which is that for me, the very definition of loneliness is about feelings of being lonely, and that's not just about social people around you or seeming social connections, but it's about whether you feel understood by those connections. So you can feel lonely in a crowded room of people talking to you because those connections aren't meaningful where you feel connected. So loneliness is really about feelings of loneliness, and that inherent within that is a lack of being understood, feeling like you're being understood by others. So I would call them one and the same.
Being social comes at such a high cost. Elaine has put, autonomy is essential. We should be the ones who choose how and when we connect. As a late diagnosed autistic, I'm still unlearning my internalized expectations. So being forced to be sociable or be in social situations one would rather not throughout one's young life can be quite damaging in terms of other people's expectations, but yes, internalizing them, what is one's supposed to do, how one's supposed to act and fit in and so on. And it can take a long time unlearning expectations or setting new ones which are kinder to oneself.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that.
Did that come up with participants, that kind of self-perception around? expectations of sociability and things?
I think in the conversations, what came up that's related to that was about how sociability is represented on social media. Like people spoke about social media much more than I'd expected to hear about it. Even people didn't really use it very much, and it was, I think it's the idea of, you know, a kind of image of what it means to be a person with a busy social life and, you know, an active life and, in, you know, friendships, and it's all mapped out, and how seeing that can often feel like a really hard mirror if you don't, if they didn't have, you know, what they saw other people seeming to have. That's where it came up in these conversations.
The comment there, loneliness is not the same as lack of sociability. It's difficult sometimes with conceptual terms and definitions, what are we actually meaning by things, and it's good to pin it down and define what it is you're actually describing. But this is the problem when, say, an autistic person says, "Oh, I'm not social." What is taken by that, by the audience, so can mean totally different things to different people. And this is another problem of just the double empathy thing and trying to get your experiences across in a meaningful way to other people if they're using a different language to narrate it.
Which is what I think we try to really probe with the questionnaire, so that we got measures of loneliness, and they were, again, self-defined. So there's no expectation about what's going to go in there. You set your own level about what makes you feel lonely. And then to differentiate loneliness from chosen solitude, we add the distress question on. So everybody's terms about what makes them feel lonely will be different. People have different drives, but according to people's own self-defined criteria, loneliness was higher in autistic people, and that was coupled to distress. Again, the distress levels were higher in autistic individuals by virtue of the higher loneliness, and you can see at the group level that those are elevated, even if some individuals choose solitude out of choice a lot of the time.
There's quite a tricky one here about being diagnosed in one's 50s and married with 4 children and increasing loneliness within a family context. How many married people were involved in the studies? So probably don't know.
I'm not sure we took that data. If Lisa was here, she could correct me. We did take some demographic data, but I'm not sure. We certainly, I don't think, report it in the paper. So I don't have the numbers to mind, but it's a good point. And later COVID related work that we did, we always asked how many people were in the household, so that we'd have sort of measures of family. But yeah, I'm sorry, I don't know that question for this.
Shows the many different levels of feelings of loneliness through lack of contact, through having lots of contact but not feeling understood within it, and all of these interweaving issues.
Yeah.
I might have misunderstood the question, but I think was part of that question about having children, and having children in the house can be potentially like quite stimulating. I might have merged the questions, but like,
tell me about it.
you know, because I think what we maybe haven't mentioned yet, I've just thought about it, is how, you know, there's sensory sensitivities to environment, but of course people are such sources of sensory stimulation and like sensory arousal, that people are so noisy and, you know, all kinds of things, and, you know, require attention and engagement, which can be, you know, a source of fulfillment but also draining. You know, it might be a balance between, well, I really want to connect with someone, but actually it's taking a lot of my sensory reserves to be able to manage it.
I mean, I saw a talk years ago about energy accounting and putting in time in schedule for downtime and this kind of stuff. But if you've got a busy family life, work life, expectations, it's where do you have the time to rest is the question I ask myself. And with busy families, it can be that sensory overload and the understanding if it's difficult to feel supported sometimes, even very close to home, as it were. Just thinking, running a bit low on time. There's a comment there, yeah, it's perfectly possible to be social with somebody while being in different rooms or doing different things. So the performance of sociability, autistic people can enjoy one another's company potentially, but it might look a bit different to the way being social is meant to be done. It's that properly social thing again.
And there was a comment by Sarah, a bit higher up, Sarah. I wonder what the relationship is between loneliness and masking, which I think kind of relates to what you've just said as well, and would be so interesting to kind of study that further as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I'm not aware on too much research from an empirical perspective on that. I think it's really important.
There's a question there on how the research might be used to inform safeguarding policies and actions, particularly with vulnerable community groups.
I haven't done much specific policy work myself, but I have done high profile events, like I was invited to the House of Parliament to talk about trying to get mental health at a level equivalent to physical health, and within academic and political networks, we do get invited as scientists to present our research and make points, and this is a message that I'm very motivated to get out there in terms of the high rates of loneliness and mental health in autistic individuals. So I am hoping that I will also be given opportunities and a voice for this as well. But I'm also very open to working with any charities or anyone who has more established routes to also get this message out.
I think it relates some to some of my own research on the kind of othering and stigma, and Monique both was mentioned earlier as well. And also to some work of mine and some work of Chrissia, who was here at the start and helped to put the event on today. Because some of our work and different studies have looked at feelings of belonging and social belonging, which is almost the opposite of loneliness. And so the factors and themes that Chrissia and I have found in our studies are all very similar, but the mirror image almost of social aspects of loneliness. So there's good links between all of our work there and social context that autistic people are living their lives within. So in the paper I co-wrote sort of 5 years ago, there was the main theme was living with the consequences of an othered identity. for the sort of social othering, but also the sort of sensorially othered in the environment. You can't, in this energy depletion over time, it's so many interweaving factors that keep coming up.
I'd said in the chat that yeah, I'd said in the chat that I didn't know of anything, but when Sarah was speaking, it made me think there's work that I helped a little bit with. NDTR, the National Development Team for Inclusion, are doing a lot of work around sensory environments, and so that it's not really necessarily addressing the loneliness angle, but it's addressing adapting the sensory environments for, in this case, young people in inpatient mental health hospitals. So it's like adding supportive measures from that angle.
I'm afraid we're out of time, but it's been a really good discussion and some really good comments and chat questions, and we had way more than we've been able to ask and bring up. It's been some really interesting stuff that brings different issues together, and it's a very important aspect of our lives and well-being, so it's looking forward to where this work may go in the future and the practical implications of what can be done about it to improve things. Great stuff. There's lots of thanks coming in the chat box for you both.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, really appreciate it. It was a real pleasure to be able to speak to you all, and thank you so much for your fascinating questions and insights.
We'll no doubt be doing more journal club events in the future, so keep a lookout for more to come. Not sure if we'll have another one this year or not. Well, maybe in the new year, but keep a lookout either way. And keep a look on the park website, because there's a park winter conference coming up in December and a workshop there, and there's always different events happening and coming up, so do take a look at the website. So, thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.